Thank you so much, Reiner, for that exceptionally thoughtful and, I have to say, excessively generous introduction. It's wonderful to be back in Fiesole, and it's a great honor to have been introduced by Reiner, whose exceptionally lucid and penetrating work on citizenship, migration, minority rights, and many other topics I've been reading with so much pleasure and profit now for more than 2 decades. I'm deeply honored to have been asked to deliver one of your Max Weber lectures, not least because I became a sociologist by struggling to come to terms with Weber's work, which remains as rich, difficult, and compelling today as it was a century ago. One of the very first things, maybe the very first thing, I was assigned to read as a college student was the dense and difficult section on types of legitimate domination, or what was called types of imperative coordination in the Parsons translation that we were using from Part 1 of Economy and Society. And this was indeed rendered all the more difficult by the fact that we were using the, how shall I say, less than felicitous translation of A.M. Henderson and Talcott Parsons. So I found this section impenetrable, yet also somehow compelling. I underlined, of course, every single word, and I was hooked. I ended up writing my undergraduate senior thesis, which, as Reiner noted, became subsequently my first book on the idea of rationality in Weber's work. And though I never took a sociology class in college, I decided to attend graduate school in sociology. So religion, conflict, and violence, few themes were more central to Weber's work than these. These themes come together at certain points in his work. Conflict and struggle, for example, were central to Weber's sociology of religion, as they were to all of his work. And Weber's compendium on the sociology of religion in economy and society, one could call it a chapter, but of course it ran to 200 pages or so, touched briefly on the development of the notion of holy war across different religious traditions. Violence was, of course, for Weber, the specific means of politics, and in politics as a vocation. Weber memorably wrote that whoever contracts with violent means for whatever ends, and every politician does, is exposed to its specific consequences. This holds especially, Weber continued, for the crusader, religious and revolutionary alike. In another famous passage from that lecture, Weber explored the ethical paradoxes arising from the experience of what he called the ethical irrationality of the world, commenting on the tendency for a believer in an ethic of ultimate ends, religious or secular, to turn into a chiliastic prophet, willing to employ violence, as Weber put it, one last time in order to bring about a world without violence. And more generally, Weber's theory of charisma as the specifically revolutionary force in history also brought together religion, politics, and violence. But the question of the religious dimensions of political conflict and violence is, of course, posed in different terms for us today. Indeed, the question is hard to escape these days. Political scientists, who were long strikingly uninterested in religious phenomena, have found religion with a vengeance in the last decade or so, while sociologists, anthropologists, and historians of religion, as well as others in the field of religious studies, have become increasingly interested in political conflict and violence. The reasons for this convergence are obvious. In general terms, the resurgence of public religion, that is, politically active and contentious forms of religious engagement in a range of settings in which religion had been prevailingly understood as a private matter, and more specifically, of course, things like the shock of the Iranian Revolution, the rise of politically activist fundamentalist movements in all major religious traditions, and the prominent implication of religion in a spate of civil wars and terrorist campaigns. The question of the religious dimensions of political conflict and violence continues to insist itself into relevance, brought into focus by the headlines with depressing regularity, including, of course, the headlines from Orlando on Sunday and from Paris or elsewhere in France Monday evening. So how should we understand the religious dimensions of political conflict and political violence? There are two broad ways of thinking about this. One view, and I'm going to call this the particularizing view, sees religiously grounded conflict and violence as sui generis, with a distinctive logic or causal texture. This view takes religious claims seriously, perhaps too seriously. The alternative, generalizing view, is that what appears to be religiously inspired conflict and violence is best subsumed under political conflict and violence in general, or under the abstract rubric of politicized ethnicity. So on this view, religious claims may mask other, more important causal factors. Religion is at best incidental to the logic or the causal texture of the conflict or violence. In my view, these stances need not be mutually exclusive. I'm going to argue that we can bring into focus both the distinctiveness of religiously informed political conflict and the ways in which many conflicts having religiously identified claimants are fundamentally similar in structure and dynamics to conflicts involving other culturally or ethnically defined claimants. I'm going to begin with the generalizing stance, but I want to devote most of my talk to specifying some distinctive ways in which religion is implicated in political conflict and violence. I'm doing this not because I think the particularizing approach is superior, but because it's less well developed. The generalizing stance, and that's what I'll begin with, is clear and well defined. The particularizing stance is not. And the strongest and, as it were, clearest particularizing statements, those that propose the strongest forms of what you could call religious exceptionalism, are simply untenable. So the challenge is to develop a more nuanced account of the distinctive ways in which religion can enter into political conflict and violence. Now, I want to confront right now at the outset a potential objection to this analytical strategy, and this is that religion and religious are hopelessly inadequate as analytical categories. They are better understood as essentially contested categories of practice. On this understanding, religion per se does not exist. What exists and what may sustain, enable, or justify political violence in certain contexts are particular practices, particular discourses, particular structures that are understood by practitioners as religious, though in some cases their religious legitimacy may be vehemently denied by others who claim religious authority. Now, I am completely sympathetic to this position, and I acknowledge that a fuller and more rigorous treatment would have to forego the use of religion or religious as categories of analysis, or at least be much more self-reflexive about defining and using these categories. Nonetheless, given the exploratory nature of this discussion, I'm willing to work here with a relatively casual and extremely imprecise notion of religion, keeping in mind that this designates not any kind of unitary thing, but a loosely related set of practices, discourses, and structures for which religious sanction is claimed by someone. So let me begin with the generalizing stance that treats religion as simply one of a number of functionally equivalent bases of identity and mobilization. This stance developed in the context of the study of ethnicity. Two strands of work can be distinguished here. The first goes back to the late Frederick Barth's influential introduction to ethnic groups and boundaries a half-century ago. Barth, you will recall, called for redirecting attention from observable patterns of shared culture to the categorical distinctions that organize and channel social interaction. The nature and dynamics of such boundaries could be studied, according to Barth, without regard to what he rather dismissively and to his later regret referred to as the cultural stuff, that is, the patterns of cultural similarity and difference. In Barth's words, the critical focus of the investigation becomes the ethnic boundary that defines the group, not the cultural stuff that it encloses. The second strand of work, out of which this generalizing stance emerged, came from efforts in the 1970s and 1980s to make sense of the surge of political mobilization on the basis of putatively primordial identities, that is, language, race, religion, caste, tribe, indigeneity, and so on. Ethnicity was constituted as an object of study in this line of work by abstracting from the specificities of language, religion, and other ascriptive markers such as phenotype, region of origin, customary mode of livelihood, and so on, and by reducing these to their common denominator as markers of identity and difference and bases of solidarity. Joseph Rothschild was one of the most sophisticated proponents of this line of work and also one of the most sophisticated analysts of East Central European society and politics. According to Rothschild, it would be pointless to separate out the notion of ethnic consciousness, solidarity, and assertiveness from religious, linguistic, racial, and other so-called primordial foci of consciousness, solidarity, and assertiveness. If this were to be done, he continued, it is difficult to see what precisely would be meant by the residual notion of ethnicity and ethnic groups. That is, if you subtracted out religion, language, race, etc., what would you have left for ethnicity? Whether political entrepreneurs mobilize along the lines of religion or language or race, Rothschild went on, is intrinsically irrelevant. I'm quoting again, since any and every one of them can be sacralized into a symbolic focus of ethnic mobilization and politicization, and this process is more or less the same whichever marker criterion is selected. Now, the Barthian study of ethnic boundaries and the political science study of politicized ethnicity developed independently of one another, though they have subsequently converged. Barth and his immediate followers were concerned with social organization, while the political scientists were concerned with political mobilization and claims making, but both lines of work treated ethnicity as a culturally empty form. Both lines of work discounted culture. What mattered was not how difference and identity were culturally construed, but rather how they were socially organized and politically expressed. And one might trace this generalizing strategy back still further to Max Weber's powerful, though fragmentary, observations on social closure. For Weber, the recurrent process of closure involving the monopolization of material and ideal goods or opportunities is independent of the substantive cultural content of insider or outsider groupings. As Weber put it, and I quote, some externally identifiable characteristic of a subset of the actual or potential competitors, race, language, religion, geographic or social origin, descent, place of residence, and so on, is taken by the others as the occasion for seeking to exclude them from competing. What characteristic this is in individual cases is irrelevant. Whatever most readily presents itself is utilized. Now, there's a certain irony here. Weber's monumental analyses of religion were particularizing, not generalizing. They took seriously both the distinctive content of religious ideas and the distinctive form of religious organization. Yet Weber's notion of social closure as a culturally empty social form had much in common with Barth's emphasis on boundaries rather than cultural content. And Weber's writings on closure also served as an inspiration for more recent generalizing treatments of politicized ethnicity, such as that of Andreas Wimmer, and for Charles Tilly's generalizing theory of categorical inequality. Be that as it may, work in this generalizing tradition subsumes religion, along with race, caste, kinship, region, language, indigeneity, and nationality, under the abstract, culturally empty rubric of ethnicity. Religion never comes into focus analytically in this tradition. This work then does not start with politicized religion and then make a case for subsuming it under a broader conceptual or theoretical rubric. Rather, it starts with ethnicity, which it defines broadly enough to embrace religion. Religion is never at the center of analytical attention. Now, In the remainder of my lecture, I'm going to start from politicized religion rather than from politicized ethnicity, and I will consider some possibly distinctive ways in which religion can inform and inflect political conflict. I consider first how religion can define the stakes of conflict, what the conflict is about, and secondly, how it can shape the modalities and mechanisms of conflict. So let me start with the stakes. Conflicts involving religiously identified parties or claimants need not involve religiously defined stakes. They may be conflicts over political power, economic resources, symbolic recognition, cultural reproduction, or national self-determination. And this is then what makes it possible and fruitful to subsume religion for certain purposes under the rubric of politicized ethnicity. So in Northern Ireland, for example, the parties to the conflict are usually identified as Catholics and Protestants, but the stakes of the conflict are not religious. The same holds for the conflict between Muslims, Orthodox Serbs, and Catholic Croats in the former Yugoslavia. To a considerable extent, I would argue this also holds for the contemporary conflicts between Shiites and Sunnis in Iraq and elsewhere, or between Alawites and Sunnis in Syria, although these contemporary cases involve both ethnopolitical conflict over who owns the state, as my former colleague Andreas Wimmer put it, and conflicts with distinctively religious stakes that pit some religiously militant Sunnis against other Sunnis, as well as against Shiites and Alawites. But in other contexts, one can't assimilate religious to ethnopolitical conflict. And here, it's important to distinguish what I would call the boundary-defining or group-constituting aspect of religion from the normative ordering power intrinsic to many forms of religious life. It's the boundary-defining aspect that allows religion to be treated for certain purposes as a form of politicized ethnicity. But the normative ordering power of religion points to the distinctively religious stakes of some political conflicts. So let me say a word about this normative ordering power and how it can generate distinctively religious stakes of political conflicts. Religious understandings of right order exist at personal, familial, communal, societal, and even cosmic levels. And in many traditions of serious or demanding religiosity, forms of right order or of disorder at these various levels are understood to be closely interconnected. So common to fundamentalisms in many religious traditions, for example, and I realize I'm using the word fundamentalisms in scare quotes because, of course, it's a term specific to the history of Protestantism. Common to such forms of serious religiosity is the argument that disorder in the family, which may be attributed to feminism or unregulated sexuality or divorce or lack of respect for paternal or husbandly authority, contributes to disorder in wider communal, societal, and political spheres. And this explains then the priority accorded in these traditions to restoring right order in the sphere of family and sexuality. Political claims arising from distinctively religious understandings of right order cannot be subsumed under a paradigm of politicized ethnicity. This is not because of the intensity of the conflict. Ethnic and nationalist conflicts, of course, can be just as intense. It's because the conflict turns on the question of how we should live, not just on questions of recognition, resources, and opportunities for cultural reproduction that are central to politicized ethnicity. Ethnic identities may be every bit as deeply felt as religious identities, but I would argue they are normatively thin, with few implications for the substantive regulation of public life. Today, the most salient religiously driven political conflicts over the substantive regulation of political life, public life, turn on claims for the implementation of Sharia, which have been central to political contestation throughout much of the Muslim world since the 1970s. What Robert Hefner has called Sharia politics, that is, struggles over the place and authority of Sharia in society, assume widely varying forms, as do understandings of what Sharia means in contemporary contexts. But the regulation of gender, sexuality, and family is almost always at stake in such conflicts, as are questions of religious freedom and relations between Muslims and non-Muslims. Outside the Muslim world, religiously defined political conflicts likewise pivot on the regulation of gender, sexuality, and the family. Conflicts over the substantive regulation of public life in the United States, for example, arise from the Christian right's efforts to ban abortion, prohibit gay marriage, restrict access to contraception, restore school prayer, and require the teaching of creationism or intelligent design in schools. Similar conflicts arise from ultra-Orthodox Jewish claims that in Israel, public buses not operate on Saturdays, that sex segregation be observed in public spaces in their neighborhoods, that sex-segregated bus lines serve their communities, and that sex segregation be preserved at the Western Wall. Now, of course, religion is not the only source of claims about the right ordering of public life. The exhaustion of communism and fascism has reduced the salience of conflict driven by comprehensive secular ideological commitments, but of course, moral crusades, social movements, and other forms of political contestation continue to be driven by secular as well as religiously informed moral commitments and understandings of right order. Still, I would argue, religion is a distinctively durable and comprehensive source of politically relevant understandings of right order, and this potent normative ordering power is what distinguishes political conflict with distinctively religious stakes from ethnopolitical conflict between parties who are simply identified in religious terms. Okay, so I've suggested that some forms of political conflict involve distinctively religious stakes, and for the remainder of my talk, I want to suggest some ways in which religiously informed political conflict and violence, and from here on I'm going to be focusing on violent conflict, can be sustained by a distinctive matrix of modalities and mechanisms. So I'm going to identify and comment briefly on 6 modalities and mechanisms. And let me begin by itemizing them just to give you a roadmap of where I'm going. The first is the social production of hyper-committed selves. The second is the cognitive and affective construction of extreme otherhood and urgent threat. The third is the mobilization of specifically religious rewards, sanctions, obligations, and ultimate meanings. The fourth is the experience of profanation. The fifth is the translocal expandability of conflict. And the last is the incentives generated by decentralized and hyper-competitive religious fields. Now, this list is neither systematic nor exhaustive. It's exploratory and illustrative. And a further caveat is that these are not specific mechanisms. Each is a broad class of what I'm calling modalities, mechanisms, and processes. So let me just jump right into the first mechanism, which is what I will call the social production of hyper-committed selves. By this I mean selves constituted by radical and uncompromising forms of commitment to a political, moral, or religious cause. And the cause is understood as unconditional, as an absolute value, not as one good among others. It's what Max Weber called a Gesinnungsethik, an ethic of conviction or an ethic of ultimate ends. The ethic of conviction is characterized by indifference to the consequences of action, as illustrated on Weber's account by the maxim, the Christian acts rightly and leaves the outcome to God. Now, hypercommitment need not entail violence. The cause to which one is committed may even expressly repudiate violence. But there is an affinity between hypercommitment and intransigence and violence. The indifference to consequences is the key. It can facilitate both the suffering and the inflicting of violence. It does so by suspending ordinary forms of moral accounting and everyday sensitivity to risk and harm in the name of an overriding concern with the one thing that matters. At the limit, this may entail indifference to the possibility or even the certainty of one's own death or indifference to the deaths of others. The discounting of consequences is the source of the extreme moral ambivalence of hypercommitment, which can enable both self-sacrificing forms of moral heroism and self-righteous forms of morally sanctified violence. Now, there's nothing uniquely religious about radical and uncompromising commitment to a cause. The paradigmatic ethic of conviction for Weber was religious, but in his great lecture, Politics as a Vocation, delivered in January 1919, during the turmoil of the November Revolution, Weber was more concerned with secular forms, and specifically with revolutionary syndicalism. And all high-risk secular collective action requires commitment and the discounting of risks. Still, religion's formidable socializing and world-defining powers make it a distinctively robust and productive source of hyper-committed selves. The power to shape selves and subjectivities and to define reality comes into focus most clearly in the case of conversion to a new and more demanding form of religious engagement. And by conversion, I do not mean conversion from one religious affiliation or category to another, but rather from one mode of religious engagement to another and more demanding one. Conversion can involve a fundamental shift in identity, a rupture in the way of seeing and experiencing the world, a relativization and devaluation of existing social ties, and a powerful cognitive, emotive, moral, and bodily resocialization. Now, obviously, certain secular organizations and movements also employ techniques of resocialization in their efforts to produce highly committed members, and commitment can intensify and crystallize in the course of unfolding struggles, but religion, I would argue, is a particularly potent matrix of the profound and durable reorganization of the self. Now, conversion, of course, does not always produce a hyper-committed self. Religious commitment shades over into what I'm calling hyper-commitment only at the extreme endpoint of a continuum. But the logic of what Weber called heroic or virtuoso religiosity, premised on an implicitly comparative and competitive frame within which claims can be made for exceptional status on the basis of exceptional religious performance, this logic makes hypercommitment an imminent and ever-recurring possibility. And when hypercommitment is generated, then it can contribute to uncompromising, high-risk, and sometimes violent forms of political action. Now, the second mechanism I want to talk about is the construction of extreme otherhood and urgent threat. Now, of course, the construction of otherhood is a general social, cultural process. It's not a distinctively religious one. And while religion is implicated in the construction of otherhood, it's also implicated in transcending divisions and constructing universalistic forms of solidarity. So here again, you see what R. Scott Appleby called the ambivalence of the sacred. Yet religion offers a distinctively potent, authoritative, renewable, transposable, and mutually reinforcing set of resources that are at once symbolic, discursive, ritual, and organizational for constructing extreme forms of otherhood that can facilitate and legitimize violence. As authoritative systems of classification, many religious traditions contain already specifically religious categories of extreme otherhood: heretic, apostate, infidel, and so on. They specify procedures, such as excommunication, or, in the Muslim world, takfir, for placing persons in those categories of extreme otherhood, and they justify and authorize violence in certain contexts against members of those categories. Of course, all religious traditions are internally contradictory, and justifications of violence stand in tension with other provisions, but categories of religiously legitimated extreme otherhood and justification for violence against such others remain available as a potent discursive resource. Religious traditions also contain elaborate and distinctive resources for constructing urgent threats and mobilizing and legitimizing action against them. Idioms of sacralization and profanation, of cosmological good and evil, of divinely sanctioned mission or holy war, of imminent catastrophe or millenarian transformation can be enlisted to raise the stakes. Judgments pronounced by religious authorities can enjoin action, including violent action, to respond to such threats. More generally, religious understandings of transcendent reality offer powerful leverage for radically devaluing the existing social and political order and for legitimizing programs of radical reconstruction, which may be understood as requiring violence. Michael Walzer, for example, famously characterized Puritanism as the template for all forms of social revolution, while Shmuel Eisenstadt traced the origin of what he called totalistic or Jacobin forms of radical politics to the transposition of transcendental religious visions generated by axial age civilizations from restricted and marginal spaces into the center of politics. More generally still, the charismatic or prophetic moment in religion, like charismatic authority in general, is intrinsically disruptive and even, as Weber argued, revolutionary. And it's no accident that both Walzer and Eisenstadt were deeply influenced by Weber. Of course, religious understandings of transcendent reality can also be mobilized against challenges to the existing social and political order. They can be used to legitimize the violent repression of challenges and challengers. The third mechanism that I want to address is the mobilization of rewards, sanctions, justifications, obligations, and what might be called deep, ultimate, or constitutive meanings. This, too, is a generic social process, yet religious entrepreneurs and organizations, or political entrepreneurs who speak the language of religion, may be able to mobilize an additional layer of rewards, sanctions, justifications, obligations, and ultimate meanings. This is suggested most clearly by the spectacular surge since 2000 in religiously legitimated or rationalized suicide attacks. As political scientists have quite rightly noted, specifically religious rewards and justifications are neither necessary for the recruitment of suicide attackers, as is shown by the anti-religious Tamil Tiger's extensive use of the tactic, nor are they sufficient, as shown by the fact that suicide attacks are overwhelmingly concentrated in a small number of theaters of conflict. Yet, religious justifications can transform such attacks from religiously prohibited suicide into religiously rewarded martyrdom, rewarded in the afterlife, where the sins of the martyr who has died for the sake of God will be washed away. Now, martyrdom, it's true, has become a secular category, and in some contexts, notably Israel, the occupied territories, and Lebanon, strong social support for suicide bombers has led to their celebration as secular heroes. But while suicide bombing in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been intensively studied, that conflict accounts for only 4% of post-2000 suicide attacks, but it's been hugely disproportionately studied. In Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, where more than 80% of post-2000 attacks have occurred, specifically religious rewards for martyrdom would appear to count for more in recruitment, especially in Pakistan and post-2011 Iraq, where suicide bombing does not involve the struggle against foreign occupation that political scientists have emphasized. Now, political scientists have tended to discount such religious rewards and justifications. For most political scientists, religion provides an ex post rationalization and justification of conduct that can be explained in non-religious terms. Now, if our aim is to explain organizational strategies, then I completely agree. There's much to be said for such skepticism. But if our aim is to understand individuals' willingness to volunteer for suicide missions, then it seems to me it's not so easy to dismiss the explanatory power of religion. The rationality and intelligibility of suicide bombing for organizations are one thing. The rationality and intelligibility for individuals who volunteer to sacrifice themselves are quite another. The religious legitimations that may serve as ex post rationalizations and justifications for organizations may operate as ex ante motivations for individuals, or at least as an ex ante form of sense making that gives suicide missions some larger meaning and purpose. So what is opportunistically employed or even cynically manipulated, of course, by organizations may be deeply and sincerely felt by individual recruits. Okay, let me turn then to the fourth mechanism, that is the experience of profanation. If one takes the categories sacred and profane in a broad Durkheimian sense, then sacred objects are simply those that are set apart and must be treated with special respect. And profanation is simply an experienced or claimed violation of the required respect. Such profanation, in the broadest sense, in the form of perceived disrespect towards special objects, places, or activities, can generate a violent response in many contexts that are not at all substantively religious. But I'm interested here in profanation in a narrower and more substantively religious sense. Violence can be provoked by deliberate attempts to desecrate the central symbols of another religion. such as Florida Pastor Terry Jones's burning of a Quran in March 2011. But a religious profanation can also be experienced without having been intended as such. This need not lead to violence. Outrage at a perceived profanation may be channeled into peaceful protest or institutional politics, but it may take anti-institutional and violent forms, as in the threats to Salman Rushdie's life and the bombing of bookstores after the publication of the Satanic Verses, or in the riots in response to the cartoons published by a Danish newspaper in 2005, or in the case of the Charlie Hebdo massacre of last year. The fifth mechanism I'll discuss concerns the translocal expandability of violent religious conflict. As a powerful form of imagined community that cuts across state boundaries, religion can serve as a vector of conflict expansion. The most spectacular recent instance of this has involved the participation of substantial numbers of Muslim foreign fighters in Afghanistan, Bosnia, Iraq, and of course Syria. 5 things are worth underscoring about this mobilization. The first is its global rather than merely regional nature. The second is the bottom-up mobilization of foreign fighters. This distinguishes their participation from state-led transborder interventions, though of course there's also now massive state-led transborder intervention in Syria. The third is the salience of ideal rather than material interests. At least in the earlier stages of the Syrian conflict, most foreign fighters were not paid, or at least not very much, and they could not and cannot expect opportunities for looting that have motivated other forms of transborder military adventurism. The fourth is the discursive framing of transborder fighting as an individual religious duty by certain influential clerics, invoking the classical distinction in Islamic jurisprudence between matters that are obligatory for each Muslim individually and those that are obligatory for the community of believers taken as a whole. This is, of course, the position of only a very small minority of Muslim clerics, but it has been an important resource for legitimating the participation of those who are receptive to the pan-Islamic discourse that highlights the urgent existential threat faced by the global Muslim Ummah. The last aspect of contemporary foreign fighter involvement worth noting is the willingness to fight rather than simply contribute financially at a safe distance. And this distinguishes foreign fighters from, say, ethnic diaspora, financial support for distant nationalist movements and insurgencies such as the Tamil Tigers, the PKK, or the IRA. In short, the contemporary mobilization of foreign fighters draws on a deeply, though of course unevenly, felt sense of personal religious obligation to defend the global imagined community of the Ummah against a vividly felt existential threat. So let me now turn to my sixth and final mechanism, which is on a somewhat different level of analysis, and this concerns the structure of religious fields. Decentralized and hyper-competitive religious fields, I want to argue, can generate structural incentives for radicalization that can foster intransigent and sometimes violent religious and political action. This was true of the post-Reformation wars of religion in 16th and 17th century Europe, and a similar dynamic is at work today in the fragmented and hyper-competitive field of contemporary Sunni Islam. The religious field of Sunni Islam has always been decentralized, but fragmentation and struggles over authority have intensified sharply in the last half-century as mass education and new media have undermined the authority of the traditionally educated ulama or legal scholars and created the space for large numbers of new interpreters to claim the right to speak in the name of Islam. In the theoretical language of Pierre Bourdieu, fields generate incentives for different kinds of position taking for those in different positions. So those who possess little of the most consecrated forms of field-specific capital, so in the field of Sunni Islam, this means those without the deep jurisprudential knowledge of the ulama, those in that position seek to valorize new forms of capital. They are structurally disposed towards heteronomy, that is, towards opening up the religious field to forms of capital and principles of valuation derived from other fields. So these include things like political or even military capital on the one hand, and the capital of notoriety or fame or media exposure on the other. And those in these positions are also structurally disposed towards strategies of outbidding, in which they claim to be more truly Islamic than others, and towards strategies of provocation intended to gain visibility and recognition. Now, this mechanism is not a specifically religious one. New entrants, this is in a Bourdieusian perspective, new entrants to all fields, not just religious ones, are disposed toward heteronomy, outbidding, and provocation. Precisely because they lack consecrated forms of field-specific capital, they seek to valorize new forms of capital. But in the fragmented, hyper-competitive field of Sunni Islam, with no structures in place for the authoritative regulation or moderation of internal conflict and competition, then these structural tendencies are greatly accentuated. Now, structural incentives for heteronomy, provocation, and outbidding in the religious field, I would argue, align with structural incentives for heteronomy in the political field. This is the case in parts of the Middle East today, where regimes have been defined by a twofold exclusion: an exclusion at once religious on the part of repressively secularist regimes, and ethno-religious on the part of substantively ethnocratic regimes. Throw into the mix what can be represented as the neo-imperial involvement of Christian powers, and you get strong incentives to religionize the political field, that is, to religionize political competition and conflict, to frame political questions as religious questions, to use religious language as an instrument of political mobilization, and so on. There are, in this setting, few and ineffective institutional arrangements to protect politics from religion, just as there are few and ineffective institutional arrangements to protect religion from politics, and specifically to protect religion from entanglement in struggles for control over the means of violence. Okay, so let me conclude. None of the modalities and mechanisms I've discussed is unique to religion, but religion provides a distinctively rich and interlocking matrix of such modalities and mechanisms. Strong forms of religious exceptionalism are easily rejected, but the strongly generalizing counterclaim that there's nothing distinctive about religiously informed political conflict and violence is equally unsatisfactory. Religion can define reality, constitute communities, nurture powerful emotions, generate commitment, re-socialize and reorganize the self, radically devalue the existing order, impose obligations, offer rewards and sanctions, furnish justifications, and intensify threats and dangers. It links cognitive dimensions of ultimate reality with structures of feeling and obligation, and in so doing, it can authorize, legitimate, enable, and even require violent action in the face of urgent threats, profanations of sacred symbols, and extreme otherhood. That religion can do so, however, does not mean that it will do so. And the very same mechanisms that can enable religiously informed political conflict to turn violent can also enable powerful forms of nonviolent, solidaristic, or humanitarian social action. The social production of hyper-committed selves can nurture moral heroism. The construction of urgent threats can radically delegitimize social evils such as exploitation, slavery, or even war itself. Transnational religion can serve as a vector of expansion of humanitarian campaigns, such as the anti-slavery movement in the 19th century. And fragmented and hyper-competitive religious fields may generate stances. I'm thinking, for example, of that of the Quakers, that categorically reject violence. So there is no intrinsic and necessary connection between religion and political violence. But religion does provide a potent assemblage of moral, ideological, and organizational resources that can, in certain contexts, inform, legitimate, or sustain violent conflict, just as they can inform, legitimate, or sustain the most admirable forms of moral and political engagement. So the analytical challenge for students of conflict and violence is to specify the conditions and contexts in which particular religious practices, discourses, fields, organizations, and structures of sentiment can contribute to the production, reproduction, and transformation of political conflict and violence. Taking up that challenge is beyond the scope of this lecture. Doing so would require a different mode of analysis at once historical, comparative, and contextual, in short, a Weberian mode of analysis, geared towards specifying when, where, why, and how the modalities, mechanisms, and dynamics outlined here are activated in ways that play into political conflict and violence. My aim in this paper has been more modest. It has been to contribute to the development of a more nuanced and qualified particularizing account of the distinctive ways in which religion can enter into political conflict and violence. Such a qualified particularizing account, I've suggested, should be understood as a complement to, not as a substitute for, a generalizing account. We should be attuned to the distinctively religious stakes of certain political conflicts, informed by distinctively religious understandings of right order that are expressed in claims for the substantive regulation of public life in accordance with religious principles. But we should also be sensitive to the distinctiveness of religion as a rich matrix of interlocking modalities and mechanisms that can, in certain contexts, contribute to political conflict and violence. Yet at the same time, we should recognize the ways in which many putatively religious conflicts, or conflicts in which the parties are identified in religious terms, are fundamentally similar in structure and dynamics to other conflicts over political power, economic resources, symbolic recognition, or cultural reproduction. Thank you.